By every rule of war, the Marines on this ridge were already dead. When the sun went down, 449 men, exhausted, scattered, dug into shallow fighting positions, faced more than 5,000 Japanese troops. No reinforcements. No air cover. No escape. Ammunition was counted by the bullet. Radios crackled with static, not answers. Somewhere beyond the tree line, thousands of boots moved through the dark, patient, confident, closing in. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder with those still able to fight. Medics worked silently, conserving morphine, knowing it would run out before the night did. Machine gun barrels were hot. Rifles filthy. Hands shook from exhaustion, not fear. Fear had come and gone hours ago. What remained was a grinding awareness that when the next attack came, there might not be enough men left to stop it, and yet the line held. That is the part that refuses to make sense. Historians still debate how this force survived even a single night, let alone what followed. Japanese commanders were certain the Marines would collapse under sheer numbers. American command, far away, had no idea how desperate the situation had become. On this battlefield, survival depended not on doctrine, but on individual Marines refusing to step back when everything said they should. As darkness deepened, the jungle seemed to close in. Shadows moved where nothing should be moving. Every man understood the same unspoken truth. Once the attack began, there would be no pause, no mercy, and no rescue coming in time. So the question isn't why they eventually broke. The real question, the one that still echoes decades later, is how 449 Marines, facing over 5,000 enemy troops, managed to hold on at all, until something happened that changed everything. From a map table thousands of miles away, the mission looked simple. Another island. Another objective. In the vast chessboard of the Pacific, this stretch of jungle barely earned a second glance. It was marked as a stepping stone, a place to secure, hold briefly, and move on. By this stage of the war, momentum felt firmly on the American side. Japanese forces were believed to be weakened, short on supplies, and increasingly desperate. Intelligence suggested limited resistance at worst, scattered remnants at best. The assumption was clear: any opposition would be handled quickly by a modest Marine force before the next operation began. No one was talking about heroics. No one was planning for disaster. The 449 Marines sent here were not elite commandos. They were regular infantrymen, experienced, disciplined, but human. Their orders were straightforward: secure the area, deny it to the enemy, and prepare for follow-on forces. They packed light, expecting speed to be their greatest protection. Heavy weapons were limited. Ammunition was calculated for a short fight. The idea of prolonged combat simply did not exist in the plan. What command did not see, or refused to believe, was how valuable this location truly was. To the Japanese, this ground was not expendable. It controlled movement, observation, and access in ways maps failed to capture. Enemy units had been concentrating there quietly, using terrain, camouflage, and time as weapons of their own. While American planners saw a minor objective, Japanese commanders saw a line they could not afford to lose. This is where the tragedy begins to take shape. The Marines were sent forward under the assumption that numbers, firepower, and initiative favored them. On paper, it was a clean operation. On the ground, reality waited patiently. Every step closer pulled them deeper into a situation no one had intended, and no one had prepared them to survive. First contact did not come with a dramatic explosion or a shouted warning. It came quietly, unevenly, through fragments of information that refused to line up. A patrol sent forward to probe the jungle failed to return on time. Then another. Enemy units had been concentrating there quietly, using terrain, camouflage, and time as weapons of their own. While American planners saw a minor objective, Japanese commanders saw a line they could not afford to lose. This is where the tragedy begins to take shape. The Marines were sent forward under the assumption that numbers, firepower, and initiative favored them. On paper, it was a clean operation. On the ground, reality waited patiently. Every step closer pulled them deeper into a situation no one had intended, and no one had prepared them to survive. By the time the first warning signs appeared, unanswered patrols, unexpected movement, uneasy reports filtering up the chain, it was already too late. The routine mission was gone. The math had changed. And the moment of first contact was about to shatter every assumption holding this operation together. What followed was not the result of reckless courage or poor discipline, but of momentum already set in motion. Orders had been given, boats unloaded, positions occupied. Turning back was no longer an option without inviting chaos. So the Marines did what they were trained to do. They pushed forward, unaware they were stepping into one of the most lopsided fights of the war. First contact did not come with a dramatic explosion or a shouted warning. It came quietly, unevenly, through fragments of information that refused to line up. A patrol sent forward to probe the jungle failed to return on time. Then another. Radio operators called their call signs again and again, hearing nothing but static and distant interference. At first, officers assumed delay, confusion, bad terrain. In the Pacific, that was normal. Then the firing started. Single shots echoed from the trees, followed by sudden, disciplined bursts. Marines moved to assist, only to find firing angles they hadn't anticipated and enemy positions already dug in. These were not scattered holdouts reacting in panic. The Japanese were waiting. Radio operators called their call signs again and again, hearing nothing but static and distant interference. At first, officers assumed delay, confusion, bad terrain. In the Pacific, that was normal. Then the firing started. Single shots echoed from the trees, followed by sudden, disciplined bursts. Marines moved to assist, only to find firing angles they hadn't anticipated and enemy positions already dug in. These were not scattered holdouts reacting in panic. The Japanese were waiting, positioned with purpose, maneuvering with confidence. Within minutes, maps drawn hours earlier became useless. Reports began to contradict one another. One squad claimed heavy contact to the east. Another reported movement from the rear. A runner arrived breathless, insisting enemy troops had been spotted where friendly lines were supposed to be secure. No one could see the whole picture, but every piece pointed in the same direction. There were far more Japanese here than anyone had planned for. As the Marines pushed and pulled at the edges of contact, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Fire came from multiple directions. Attacks were coordinated, not random. Enemy units appeared, disappeared, then reappeared closer than before. Japanese forces were not just defending ground. They were shaping the fight, probing for weak points, testing reactions, mapping the Marines' positions in real time. The realization settled slowly and then all at once. This was not a meeting engagement. It was an ambush unfolding in stages. Withdrawal options were discussed briefly, then quietly set aside. The terrain that concealed the enemy now blocked movement. Trails that had seemed adequate hours earlier were suddenly lethal corridors. Pulling back under pressure would mean exposing flanks, abandoning wounded, and inviting pursuit. Radio traffic spiked, then deteriorated. Messages overlapped. Coordinates were misheard. Requests for clarity went unanswered as higher command struggled to understand what was happening from miles away. On the ground, officers stopped waiting for guidance and began making decisions on instinct and experience. Every minute mattered. By the time firing spread along the perimeter, the sense of being surrounded was no longer theoretical. Marines could feel it in the way shots echoed, in how enemy fire adjusted faster than expected, in the uncomfortable knowledge that Japanese troops were moving where no one could see them. Confusion hardened into urgency. The fight had arrived sooner and heavier than anyone expected. When the order came to dig in, no one pretended it was temporary. Entrenching tools came out immediately, blades biting into roots and rock as Marines carved shallow foxholes wherever the ground would allow it. Time mattered more than comfort. Every scrape of dirt was a small insurance policy against what everyone knew was coming. The terrain, once just another obstacle, became the Marines' greatest ally. Fields of fire were carved through vegetation by hand and by gunfire. Machine gun crews positioned themselves to overlap lanes, creating deadly corridors where no single position stood alone. Bar gunners were shifted again and again, plugging gaps as they appeared. Nothing was fixed. The defense was constantly adjusting, breathing, reacting. Faces began to stand out. A corporal calmly repositioned a gun team under fire, his voice steady despite the chaos. A private, hands blistered and shaking, kept digging long after his strength should have given out. Junior leaders stepped forward without ceremony, issuing orders, checking sectors, dragging wounded men into cover. Rank mattered less than resolve. Whoever was closest made the call. Exhaustion pressed down on everyone. Sweat-soaked uniforms. Hands cramped around rifles. Men had been awake far longer than training ever demanded, but no one stopped. They couldn't. Retreat was no longer a real concept. There was nowhere safe to fall back to, no line waiting behind them. The ground they held was the line. Improvisation became doctrine. Ammunition was redistributed by need, not by unit. Weapons were shared. Positions were reinforced with whatever could stop a bullet, or at least slow one down. The perimeter took shape not as a perfect circle, but as a series of stubborn points, each one anchored by Marines who understood that if their position failed, everything beside it would unravel. When the first sound came, it wasn't gunfire. It was a voice. Low, deliberate, drifting through the darkness in a language most Marines did not understand, but instantly recognized. Japanese soldiers were speaking from the jungle, close enough to be heard, far enough to remain unseen. It was meant to unnerve, and it worked. Then the night exploded. Flares burst overhead, briefly turning jungle into a frozen photograph of charging figures and tangled terrain. Machine guns opened up, tracers slicing through blackness, rifles cracking until their reports blurred together. The Japanese came in waves, screaming, running straight at the perimeter, daring the Marines to stop them. Some fell immediately. Others kept coming, stepping over bodies without slowing. Between the charges came something worse. Infiltrators. Small groups slipping through gaps no one knew existed, crawling close enough to throw grenades, to fire from behind, to turn foxholes into traps. The darkness erased distance and direction. Marines fired at muzzle flashes, at shadows, at movements sensed more than seen. Every position became its own isolated fight. Voices whispered again, closer now. Sometimes in English. Sometimes laughing. Sometimes crying out as if wounded, drawing fire, drawing Marines to expose themselves. Psychological warfare blended seamlessly with violence. Sleep deprivation sharpened fear. Adrenaline erased fatigue. Time stretched and collapsed, measured only by the next reload. The fighting turned personal. Bayonets flashed. Rifle butt swung. Hands grabbed in the dark, grappling for control of weapons. Men fought at arm's length, faces inches apart, reacting on instinct alone. There was no room for hesitation. A second of doubt meant death. Machine gun barrels glowed red, crews swapping them out with bare hands wrapped in cloth, fingers burned numb. Ammunition ran low faster than anyone expected. Marines fired until weapons jammed, cleared them, fired again. When magazines ran dry, rifles were fed single rounds. When those were gone, Marines reached for anything that could be used to keep the line intact. Some positions were briefly overrun, then retaken in vicious counterattacks. Others held by men who refused to move, even as grenades detonated nearby, showering dirt and shrapnel into foxholes already slick with blood and rain. Medics crawled through fire to reach the wounded, dragging men back by webbing, by arms, by whatever they could grip. Hours passed like this, attack after attack, the jungle never fully quiet. Every lull felt like a trick, a breath held before the next surge. Marines stopped thinking in terms of victory or survival beyond the next minute. The world narrowed to front sights, trigger pulls, and the voices of nearby men shouting warnings or encouragement. When the sky finally began to lighten, the attack slowed, then faded back into the trees. No cheers followed. No relief. As dawn crept over the battlefield, the Marines could finally see what the night had taken from them, and the cost of holding the line was far worse than anyone had imagined. The first light of dawn cut through the jungle in soft, golden shafts, painting the foliage with a deceptive calm. Birds sang. The wind rustled leaves. For a brief moment, the world seemed untouched by the violence that had raged hours before. Then the Marines opened their eyes. The illusion shattered instantly. Bodies lay tangled along the perimeter, friend and foe indistinguishable in the mud and blood. Foxholes that had seemed sturdy in the darkness were now little more than craters, their edges smoothed over by feet, frantic digging, and the pounding of countless attacks. Ammunition crates sat empty or partially spent, each round fired a reminder of the relentless pressure of the night. Medical supplies were nearly gone, and the medics moved silently from casualty to casualty, doing what they could with what little remained. Commanders climbed over fallen men to assess the line. They counted, recounted, and realized with a sinking certainty just how thin the defense had become. Sections of the perimeter had been abandoned, others barely held. Every soldier left standing carried the weight of knowing that if the enemy renewed the assault now, the ridge could fall in minutes. The irony pressed in. The sunrise was beautiful, serene, almost mocking. It highlighted what had survived and what had been lost. Nature's calm contrasted with the devastation humans had wrought, and in that moment, the Marines felt the true scale of the cost they had paid. Leaders huddled briefly, weighing impossible options. Hold the line, despite exhaustion and dwindling resources, and risk annihilation? Attempt a breakout, potentially leaving the wounded behind to die in enemy hands? Or dig in again and hope luck, or something more, favored them through the next wave? Every choice carried a deadly consequence. The survivors understood the unspoken truth: retreat was not an option. They could not rely on reinforcements arriving in time. They could not predict the enemy's next move. The line had to hold, not for glory, not for orders, but because nothing else was possible. And in that impossible balance of risk, the seeds of leadership, of courage and ingenuity under fire, would define who lived, who died, and how the story of that ridge would be remembered. Amid the smoke, mud, and broken terrain, leadership became the line between survival and annihilation. Commanders had no clear picture, reports were fragmentary, radios sputtered and died, and the enemy seemed to appear where none should have been. Yet decisions could not wait. Every call, every order, had immediate consequences in blood and fire. Lieutenant Harris, barely 25, paced along the perimeter, listening to the whispers of the men and the crackle of sporadic gunfire. He had to decide whether to pull back a flank exposed by the night's chaos or risk holding it with a handful of exhausted Marines. Pulling back might conserve manpower, but it could also create a gap that the Japanese would exploit instantly. He chose to hold. Men followed him because they trusted his judgment, not because orders demanded it. That choice kept a critical sector intact, buying time for the rest of the line to regroup. Elsewhere, Sergeant Callahan moved like a shadow between foxholes, redistributing ammunition, positioning the few remaining grenades, and improvising firing lanes where the jungle had chewed up the original plan. He barked instructions that cut through the panic. "Shift left! Cover the gap! Hold your sector!" His calm decisiveness inspired Marines who were minutes from exhaustion to act with renewed purpose. Every action he took prevented small breaches from becoming catastrophic collapses. Other moments were quieter but no less crucial. A corporal noticed a lone enemy sniper pinning down a section of men and, without orders, crawled under fire to neutralize the threat. In another position, a machine gunner, short on ammunition, commandeered a fallen enemy weapon mid-fight and kept his line alive. Each act, small on its own, compounded into a defense that held when logic suggested it could not. These leaders were not immune to fear. Each choice carried the weight of lives, and the margin for error had evaporated. But courage, improvisation, and a strict adherence to training forged a temporary shield against the impossible. In these few hours, the line remained unbroken, but only barely doubt if any of these decisions had gone differently. If hesitation had replaced resolve, if exhaustion had overtaken discipline, the ridge would have fallen. The Marines would have been overwhelmed, scattered, or slaughtered. Instead, leadership under fire preserved enough structure for the men to survive, just long enough for the battle to reach its next, even more dangerous stage. The enemy pressure that had already tested every nerve and muscle was about to escalate beyond anything the defenders had yet experienced. By mid-morning, the Japanese had regrouped, their intent clear. They threw everything they had at the ridge in waves of coordinated attacks, each one sharper, faster, and more relentless than the last. Artillery shells pounded the positions, shaking trees loose and throwing dirt over already bloodied foxholes. Machine gun nests churned out fire in every direction, yet the enemy continued advancing, seemingly impervious to the damage they took. The Marines counted every round. Every single bullet became precious. They fired until barrels glowed, then swapped weapons with the wounded or scavenged rifles from fallen enemies. Grenades were measured, thrown only when absolutely necessary, because once gone, there was no replacement. Yet each Marine understood that even one extra round might save a comrade's life, and every shot held the difference between holding the line or being overrun. Infantry charges surged repeatedly. Japanese soldiers moved through the broken terrain with deadly precision, scaling ridges, slipping through jungle gaps, and testing every weak point. Some positions were lost briefly, men forced to pull back under overwhelming fire. Other sections of the perimeter clung to survival by inches, with Marines lying flat, praying, and firing relentlessly. Each counterattack, no matter how small, reclaimed territory, but at a terrible cost in blood and exhaustion. In the chaos, improvisation became instinct. A Marine who had lost his rifle grabbed a fallen enemy's weapon, turning it against its former owner. Explosions from mortars shattered lines of trees, forcing rapid repositioning. Officers shouted orders over the roar, running between positions to plug gaps, coordinate fire, and reinforce sectors threatened with collapse. Junior leaders again stepped forward, taking control of clusters of men whose unit cohesion had frayed under the sustained assault. Even with every tactic, every act of courage, the weight of numbers pressed unbearably. The Marines' stamina was fraying. Faces streaked with sweat, blood, and grime reflected grim determination, but also exhaustion that ran deeper than muscle fatigue. Their line could not hold forever. The ridge itself seemed to press down on them, every tree, every root, every incline a potential hazard as the enemy exploited the terrain with local knowledge. It was as if the night had never ended. Waves of enemies crashed against them, ebbing only to surge again, coordinated and relentless. Every survival tactic, every desperate improvisation, kept the line from breaking, but the sense of inevitable defeat tightened like a noose. The ridge teetered on the edge of collapse. Every Marine knew that if the next attack succeeded, this small force would vanish, erased from the island and from history. And then, just as defeat seemed not only possible but certain, something shifted. A turn of events, unanticipated by the enemy, unseen by most of the defenders, changed the rhythm of the battle. The Marines, battered, outnumbered, and exhausted, would face a moment that no one had expected, and it would alter everything. The ridge had been ground zero for hours of relentless assault. Marines crouched in foxholes, muscles screaming, fingers blistered from firing without pause. Every sector had been tested, every defensive line pushed to its limit. And then it happened, an event so sudden, so precise, that for a moment, disbelief rippled through both sides. From offshore, the first thunderous booms of naval artillery rolled across the island. Shells screamed over the ridge, crashing into Japanese positions with devastating effect. Trees exploded, earth erupted, and entrenched enemy forces were thrown into confusion. Marines pressed forward with renewed fire, buoyed not just by physical relief but by the psychological shock that reinforcements, long hoped for, long doubted, had arrived in force. Air support followed soon after. Fighter bombers swept low over the jungle canopy, releasing bombs and strafing the advancing waves. The enemy, who had been confident, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable, faltered. Movement slowed. Coordination broke down. Panic flickered across lines that had been pressing forward relentlessly. In the chaos, Marines exploited every hesitation, reclaiming lost positions, reorganizing sectors, and stabilizing points that had been on the verge of collapse. It was not a miracle. It was a combination of timing, strategy, and sheer persistence. Intelligence had coordinated with naval and air assets to strike at exactly the moment when the defenders were stretched thin. Every hour the Marines had held their line had made this intervention possible. Without their stubborn resistance, the artillery and air strikes might have arrived too late to make a difference. Their survival had, paradoxically, shaped the battle's decisive moment. For the Japanese, the shift was catastrophic. Confidence turned to confusion, then to disorder. Attacks faltered as their formations were fragmented by explosions and strafing fire. Units that had pushed relentlessly through the night now faced an enemy reinforced by the shock and awe of firepower they had not anticipated. For the first time in the battle, momentum swung in favor of the Americans, and it did so with a clarity that stunned both sides. For the Marines, the relief was immediate but measured. They still faced danger. The ridge was not yet secure. But the psychological weight lifted, allowing exhausted men to breathe, to regroup, and to begin stabilizing the perimeter. Leaders moved with precision, redistributing ammunition, repositioning forces, and preparing for the inevitable counterattacks, now slowed and disorganized. This moment, the sudden intervention, the collapse of enemy momentum, the validation of every desperate decision made in the dark, became the pivot of the battle. The ridge, which had teetered on the brink of annihilation, now stood firm. The turning point was decisive, not miraculous. It was the product of human endurance, courage, and the precise convergence of support that transformed the impossible into survival. Dawn revealed the full scope of the ridge's ordeal. The ground was a tapestry of destruction: churned earth, shattered trees, spent shell casings, and bodies interwoven with foliage. Marines crawled from foxholes, faces streaked with mud, sweat, and blood, blinking against the morning light. The silence was deafening after hours of relentless fire, broken only by distant groans, the occasional cough, or the quiet movement of medics dragging the wounded to improvised aid stations. Casualty counts were staggering. Nearly half the unit had been killed or severely wounded. Men who had fought side by side for hours counted the living and realized friends, brothers in arms, would never answer again. Guilt and relief twisted together in every mind. They had survived, yes, but at a cost that would haunt the living for the rest of their lives. Conversations were sparse. Words seemed inadequate. Silence became the common language of exhaustion, grief, and incredulity. Movements in real time rather than relying solely on predetermined plans. Officers learned how junior leaders stepping up could stabilize sectors under extreme stress, and how morale, courage, and initiative were as critical as firepower. Each foxhole, each improvised barricade, each decision to hold a fragile line became a case study in resilience under pressure. The battle also reinforced the importance of terrain. Military theorists pointed to how the Marines exploited natural choke points, elevation, and vegetation to multiply the effectiveness of their smaller force. What looked like a routine objective on a map became a linchpin in both strategy and survival. Analysts emphasized that knowing how to fight within the environment, rather than against it, could turn disadvantage into opportunity. Even today, these lessons remain embedded in Marine Corps doctrine and taught in classrooms and training exercises around the world. The Ridge demonstrated that courage alone is not enough. It must be paired with smart tactics, adaptability, and leadership at every level. The survival of this small force against overwhelming odds remains a testament to the enduring principles of warfare and a reminder of how the human element can shape the course of history. Amid the statistics of survival and loss, there were faces and names that refused to be forgotten. Corporal Harris, who had held the exposed flank against impossible odds, returned home but carried the weight of every man he could not save. Sergeant Callahan, whose hands had redistributed ammunition and patched broken lines in the darkness, went on to train new Marines, sharing lessons learned at the edge of annihilation. Some did not return at all, their absence a quiet echo in the memories of comrades who had survived. Each Marine had a story beyond the numbers. Privates who fired enemy weapons in desperation, medics who crawled under fire to pull men to safety, and officers making split-second decisions. These were not just names on a roster. They were human beings, defined by courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Survivors would speak of the Ridge for years, often with quiet reverence, describing the chaos, fear, and camaraderie that had held them together. History often remembers victories, battles won, and strategic triumphs. But here, survival itself became the legacy. The ridge was preserved not through luck alone, but through the determination and ingenuity of individuals who refused to let overwhelming odds dictate their fate. The stories of these men, who lived, who died, and who endured, remind us that behind every statistic lies human courage, quiet heroism, and the personal cost of war. In the end, the ridge was neither a conventional victory nor a clear defeat. The Japanese forces had not been completely repelled, and the Marines had paid a devastating cost in lives and exhaustion. Yet the true triumph lay not in territory gained or lost, but in survival itself, the defiance of overwhelming odds, the endurance of human will, and the refusal to be erased by numbers, firepower, or circumstance. This story resonates because it reminds us that heroism is often quiet, measured not in grand gestures but in sustained courage under impossible pressure. It is the Marines' discipline, adaptability, and stubbornness that transformed a near-certain annihilation into a testament of human resilience. Every bullet fired, every position held, every life saved against the tide became part of a legacy that outlasted the battle itself. 49 Marines walked into history, and refused to disappear. Their story continues to teach, inspire, and challenge us, showing that even in the darkest hours, endurance, leadership, and collective resolve can shape outcomes that defy expectation. In remembering their fight, we honor not just strategy or tactics, but the human spirit that made survival, in its most raw and essential form, the ultimate victory.